Hallo zusammen. Pascal hier von Neutrality Studies und heute rede ich
Hello everyone, Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm speaking for the second time with Dr. Erich Vad, a former German brigadier general and advisor on security and defense policy in the Bundestag, as well as military advisor to Chancellor Angela Merkel. On August 18th, which should actually be today, if my YouTube scheduling is correct, a new book is being released that presents a conversation between Mr. Vad and Mr. Klaus von Dohnanyi, a veteran of the SPD and former Minister of Education, who was also mayor of, let me just recall, not Hanover, but Hamburg.
Jetzt muss ich mich gerade daran erinnern, nicht von Hannover, sondern von Hamburg. Das Buch trägt den
The book bears the striking title, War or Peace, Germany at the Crossroads. Today, we want to discuss the theses presented in the book. So, Mr. Vad, welcome back. Hello, Mr. Lataz. Greetings to you. Congratulations as well on the book, which is being published today. You had a discussion with Mr. von Dohnanyi. Could you briefly explain the background to this and what the book conveys?
Erklären und was das Buch wiedergibt.
Naja, Herr von Dohnanyi und ich haben uns kennengelernt im Zuge der
Well,
Ukraine-Debatte.
Mr. von Dohnanyi and I got to know each other during the Ukraine debate, also through our book publications. He wrote the bestseller National Interests, and I wrote my bestseller Emergency for Germany. That's how we started talking and often corresponded with each other. At some point, the idea came up to have a joint discussion about war and peace, what Germany should do, how the international situation looks, and so on. That took place at the beginning of July. From that, the idea arose to document this conversation in a book. And that's what we did. As I said, the book will be released on August 18th.
Das Buch kommt, wie gesagt, am 18. August auf den Markt.
Und das Buch ist sehr eindrücklich eigentlich auch, weil es beginnt.
And the book is actually very impressive, also because it begins with Mr. von Dohnanyi's recollection. He was 16 years old in 1945 and was still drafted into the German military, that is, the National Socialist military, and had to serve there, and how terrible that actually was. What has stayed with you from that, or how did it affect you when he talked about it?
In Erinnerung, oder wie hat das auf Sie gewirkt, dass das erzählt hat?
Ja, es war ganz interessant und unerwartet, dass wir beide...
Yes, it was quite interesting and unexpected that we both started with the topic of war. His personal experiences as a young soldier at the end of World War II, and then my professional experience, ultimately over 40 years in the military, and my studies on Clausewitz, my doctoral thesis, and everything that has engaged and connected us with the subject of war. And both of us, von Dohnanyi and I, have very different backgrounds. We come from very different political camps, not just political camps, but also from, well, entirely different spectrums. He is more shaped by politics, and I am more shaped by the military.
Geprägt, ich mehr vom Militär geprägt. Und insofern haben wir mit Krieg angefangen und haben uns darüber...
So we started with the topic of war and exchanged views on it, and then of course we moved on to the current issues in international relations, and naturally also discussed how Germany should behave in light of the war in Ukraine, and with regard to Russia, the US, and also China. Those were the main topics, and it was a 3.5-hour conversation. I can tell you it was quite an experience for me, because after being initiated by a journalist, the conversation took on a life of its own. It went back and forth like a ping-pong match, and it was truly fascinating.
Und es war richtig faszinierend, das Ganze.
Das glaube ich, das sieht man auch im Buch, also in der Verschriftung.
You can also see this in the book, in the written form, how they talk to each other and build on each other's thoughts. And if I remember correctly, a very important part of the whole thesis that develops is Mr. von Clausewitz, and the observation that it is nonsense to try to think of war as separate from politics. Could you perhaps say a few words about that?
Könnten Sie vielleicht darüber kurz noch etwas sagen?
Ja, das ist natürlich der Punkt, der auf Clausewitz zurück...
Yes, that is of course the point that goes back to Clausewitz. And personally, I spent many years in the military, but also many years in politics, as a military person in politics. And with regard to Clausewitz, I can no longer think of war without politics. And basically that leads us to the war in Ukraine. We have never had a political concept for how we want to conduct this war, what our military aid is for. We have never had a strategy for how to get out of this war. By we, I mean us as Germans or also as Europeans. And in that respect, we had many historical references in this conversation, also to Otto von Bismarck, to the Rhine-Schurz Treaty with Russia. The conversation is not at all historicizing, but it is interspersed with historical experience. I also found that very fascinating, but at the same time very down to earth and related to the current situation.
I think that's very important. One of the chapters, or rather one of the sections of the book, is titled, Merz Thinks in a Completely Unhistorical Way. So Mr. Friedrich Merz, the opposition leader, thinks in a completely unhistorical way. In what way is that a major problem for German foreign policy?
Yes, so Donani has criticized Merz quite a bit on this point, but ultimately it affects a lot of Germans, including those in leading positions. Somewhere along the way, perhaps after the catastrophe of 1945, which is now 80 years ago, we completely forgot how to think and act in terms of national interests. Germany also lacks a unifying national narrative, if we're being honest. Most Germans don't even know what they stand for or what their purpose is. Even in the international concert of powers, including the great powers, where we have to find our place again. The world is fundamentally changing, and the North, the West, is no longer setting the tone. There is the global South, which is coming together with China, India, Brazil, the BRICS countries. We are right in the middle of this transformation of the international arena, so to speak, politically, militarily, and economically, and we are fully involved in it. And as Germany, we need to reposition ourselves. That is becoming increasingly clear. There is absolutely no way we can continue as we have in recent years and decades. We need to change that, and we need to relearn how to think much more strongly in terms of national interests. That has nothing to do with nationalism, but our political and military elites have completely forgotten how to do that. And we need to relearn it. Trump and Putin, for example, are demonstrating this to us. And the rules-based order, it no longer exists. Maybe it never really did. Perhaps in the past that was just a disguise for the real power dynamics. And one has to, I'm not always happy about Trump, but one has to give him credit for the fact that his behavior simply exposes what it's really about. Namely power and influence politics, the pursuit of national interests. The law of the strongest, yes, it's pretty brutal. So it's a lesson for Germans to learn as well, and that's why for Germany, it also means that we need to position ourselves more strongly politically and economically, and also militarily. We need a functional army, that's without question, and we simply can't continue the way we have in recent years and decades.
Und können einfach nicht mehr so weitermachen wie in den letzten Jahren und Jahrzehnten.
Woher denken Sie, kommt das Verlernen?
Where do you think this comes from? That people have unlearned or even been discouraged from thinking in terms of national interests, especially in Europe. And I think you're right to emphasize, this doesn't mean nationalism. It simply means having a sense that what Germany needs and how Germany can develop economically and in other ways is simply different from how Poland, Italy, China, or the USA can develop and what they need for that. So it's legitimate to say, okay, we also need certain things, and we look out for those. So where do you see the point at which this understanding left Europe?
Yes, I believe, especially from a German perspective, and I mean these are of course the experiences of our history, that we said, so we will no longer pursue a policy based on national interests, but instead integrate ourselves into the European Union, for example, as a task, ultimately as a major political undertaking, which has indeed been successful. or to contribute militarily and in terms of defense policy to NATO. And I have experienced this myself in my professional life. When German officers joined NATO, they largely forgot their nationality. And that was never the case with colleagues from other countries. And of course, that is partly due to our fractured self-confidence as a result of our history.
Und wir haben das ja gründlich aufgearbeitet, aber
And we have thoroughly addressed this, but it can't go on like this, because otherwise we run the risk of really driving our country, maybe even completely into the ground, in this confrontation, now also between the US and China and with Russia. This can't continue. So when I look at the last 3.5 years, we have managed a kind of political altruism, especially in the centrist parties, which is where I come from, going all in for Ukraine, giving everything for that country, and we have forgotten to put our own country, our own interests, which we also have, first. With this excessive moralism from a German perspective, we really run the risk of messing everything up.
Aus deutscher Sicht alles zu vergeigen. Also das muss man wirklich feststellen.
Well, that really needs to be stated clearly. And we really need a change of direction here, also, in foreign and security policy. That's absolutely clear. And we also need to look at economic policy. We've had this experience with Trump's tariff policy and that great deal in Scotland on the edge of a golf course, which is symptomatic of all this, and it just keeps going. And we also need to consider how we position ourselves economically. We are an economic powerhouse globally, and we must not allow ourselves to be led around by the nose. We simply have to draw tough consequences and shift our economic focus accordingly, for example, toward the global south. And under no circumstances should we go along with this strategic decoupling from China. No way. And we have to see if Trump and Putin really do come to an agreement, which we don't know yet, but if this really leads to an end to this war, that we reestablish a normal relationship with Russia. And I'm telling you this from the perspective of Germany's national interests, because we cannot afford a war in Central Europe. I'll put it very simply, the war must not take place here. We have to get out of this. That was also the topic, the fundamental topic of Russia, of our book. I'm not saying this because I'm a pacifist, but because I don't want my country to end up in a war and ultimately go to the dogs. And that's why we need a completely different foreign and security policy. And I think that lesson has also been learned in Berlin.
Ich denke, die Lektion hat man in Berlin auch gelernt.
Sind Sie sich dessen sicher, weil die Töne, die wir im Moment noch immer
Are you sure about that? Because the tones we're still hearing from Berlin at the moment are quite warlike. There are also these calls for rearmament, remilitarization, and military readiness. Right now, you hear a lot of that, even in the German media. But maybe I've been watching too much media and not enough politics.
Zu viel Medien und zu wenig Politik auch gesehen.
Naja, diese Kriegsrhetorik auch der
Well, this war rhetoric over the past 3 years was terrible, really. Even from representatives of the political camp I myself come from. And I was also surprised that the moderate, reasonable voices politically, at least in the old arithmetic, tended to come from the left and the right. That needs to stop as well. I mean, you can see that it hasn't achieved anything, all of it. And then it's also somewhat hypocritical. Those who were the biggest warmongers have never seen the inside of a barracks, never held a weapon in their hands. In the past, they did everything they could to undermine the military, the Bundeswehr, and defense readiness. They were the worst agitators in this area. They would have loved to drag us into a world war with Russia for Ukraine. And that was a pretty disappointing experience.
War schon eine ziemlich enttäuschende Erfahrung.
Hätten am liebsten die anderen für einen Weltkrieg.
I'd say they would have preferred to push others into a world war with Russia, because that's absolutely true. These people don't go to war themselves. They say others should fight the war. That's exactly what's happening with Ukraine right now. Ukraine is supposed to fight the war. Ukraine is supposed to win, and we're supposed to be there to support them, meaning us, the rest of Europe. I think this whole debate is incredibly hypocritical because it completely turns the horror of war on its head.
des Krieges so absolut umdreht. Im Moment haben wir auch eine neue Studie von Gallup.
At the moment, we also have a new study from Gallup showing that 69% of Ukrainians now want the war to end and no longer want to keep fighting at any cost. Why do you think that in Germany, this perception still doesn't exist? How terrible it would be if this war were to escalate further. Why are there still people who come forward and say, no, we actually have to prepare for war? After all, your book is titled War or Peace. So at some point, we either have to de-escalate or it will actually end in war.
Ja, das ist das Gefährliche und es ist noch nicht.
Yes, that's what's dangerous. And it's still not certain. I mean, we had this conversation at the beginning of July. It's still not clear whether we will end up in a European war or in a Cold War, which would also demand a lot from us, or in a frozen conflict with Russia. All of that is bad for Germany and also bad for Europe. We pointed that out in the book, and that cannot be a rational option. We have to avoid that. And that's why we need to get out of this war mode. We need to do what the Americans have been doing since Trump took office. You can say what you want, but they talk to the Russians on all channels. There's the hotline between the White House and the Kremlin, between the general staffs of the armies, between the intelligence agencies. Secret diplomacy has taken place and is still taking place. Steve Witkoff was recently, this was all over the media, he actually helped prepare this summit with both Putin and Trump, politically and in terms of content, while we Europeans, especially the Germans, were so proud that we no longer talk to this evil Putin. That's actually so foolish. Not to mention that it's pointless to deliver weapons. I think they have their value. I also support the fact that military aid was given to Ukraine so that they wouldn't be steamrolled, so that they could basically be put in a position to negotiate with the Russians. But there was a refusal to actually talk to the enemy. And that, politically speaking, is basically the end of politics. The focus was entirely on bellicism, rearmament, and military aid without having a political concept for how to end this war. You can basically throw the last 4 years of German foreign and security policy in the trash.
You have a section of the book titled, Deterrence is Important. But even more important is that a potential enemy has an interest in peace. And it seems to me that in the current debate about deterrence, this second part is being completely forgotten, namely that the best security is when an enemy has no interest in war. In other words, that you somehow reach an agreement with the other side or with others so that you can interact with each other the way Germany and France do today, where neither fears the other. No one in Germany needs to deter France. Why is this being forgotten?
Warum geht das vergessen?
Yes, that's a good point, Mr. Latas. Klaus von Donani addressed that. I approached these issues more from a military strategic perspective, and of course said that we need to do more, also for defense. And in NATO, we've always practiced the Harmel Doctrine since the 1960s. That means we've always relied on military strength, but in combination with dialogue, confidence building, with the then adversary, the Warsaw Pact. At its core, it was Russia, even back then. And he said that's not enough. You also have to awaken an interest in peace that goes beyond that. That interest has to be greater than the interest in war. And he was right about that. We just have to see how I am in favor of a war-capable army, and we don't have that in Germany. According to the latest INSA surveys, our willingness to defend is at 16%. 16% of Germans would defend their country with a weapon in hand. And that is dramatically low, this willingness to defend. But it is also partly influenced by the policies we pursue. A few years ago, Germany's security was supposedly being defended in the Hindu Kush, then in Mali, and now suddenly at the Dnipro and at some point in the Indo-Pacific. That can't be right. In fact, our Constitution gives us a clear mandate for national defense, a clear mission for our armed forces. And for that, the Bundeswehr needs to be restored. That will take a few years, and for this we do not need a new enemy image of Russia.
Und wir brauchen deswegen kein neues Feindbild Russland. Das haben wir im Kalten Krieg übrigens auch nicht gebraucht.
By the way, we didn't need that during the Cold War either. It's basically not necessary at all, but we do need a proper army, which we don't have at the moment. At the start of the war in Ukraine, the Bundeswehr was depleted, as the then inspector of the army said, and thanks to our arms deliveries from Bundeswehr stocks, it's now even more depleted than before. That means there's absolutely no material defense capability, and even less so in terms of morale and mindset. And of course, we need to change that, we need to improve it, but all of that alone is not enough for peace. I'm very grateful that Klaus von Donani also addressed this in our conversation, that it has to be more than that we simply have to find our way back to a normal relationship with Russia, specifically regarding Russia.
In ein normales Verhältnis mit Russland. Das muss unsere Aufgabe sein, und zwar im Kontext auch.
That must be our task, especially in the context of the current American initiatives and in coordination with our alliance partners. There is a need for action, and a lot is coming Germany's way. I myself spent years in the Chancellery, and under our chancellors we always had lines of communication to Moscow. There were arguments, there were differing opinions, and we need to rebuild those lines, also in business, in politics, and in the military sphere. Ultimately, everything depends on the Americans, on Trump, and whether he manages in the coming weeks and days to get out of this war mode with Russia or not.
Aus diesem Kriegsmodus mit Russland rauszukommen oder nicht. Und wenn wir nicht rauskommen und es geht weiter in der Eskalationsspirale.
And if we don't get out of this and the escalation spiral continues, then I see dark times ahead. If it actually comes to a European war, we also have to recognize this war is far away from the USA, 6,000 kilometers, and from an American perspective, it is indeed a rational option. Even a limited nuclear war in Europe, why not? It has certain advantages, and you can also make big deals with it, to use Trump's words. But it is not an option for Germany, not an option for Europe. That's the point. That's why we really must have an interest in re-establishing normal relations with Russia, also in economic, political, and military terms.
Im wirtschaftlichen Bereich, politischen Bereich und militärischen Bereich.
Müsste denn, was Sie sagen, erscheint mir alles
What you're saying all sounds very reasonable and logical to me, but to many of our fellow citizens in Germany and Switzerland, it seems like a misguided interpretation of how to deter the Russians. But the fact is, we are currently caught in this spiral of escalation, especially now that, for example, we are deploying missiles, intermediate-range missiles, which clearly pose a significant threat to Russia. And just recently, a few days ago, Russia said, fine, we will also end our own moratorium and start deploying missiles again that could reach Berlin and Paris within a few minutes. So shouldn't Europe be saying that this is exactly what we need to work on, that we need to pack away these categories of weapons that are obviously offensive and only equip ourselves with defensive means so that we can break out of this spiral?
damit wir eben aus dieser Spirale rauskommen.
Naja, diese Vereinbarung der Deutschen mit den
Well, this agreement between the Germans and the Americans regarding the deployment of intermediate-range missiles also includes defensive systems, but also offensive ones. But what I criticize about it is this German reflex to hand over responsibility in this area. We are, after all, threatened by corresponding Russian systems from the Kaliningrad Oblast, and at first glance, there is some justification for countering that. But it cannot be that we hand over this responsibility, the political responsibility for the deployment of these American systems, to America, and let America decide when, where, and in what manner these systems are used. That has to become a German responsibility, and we need to learn that. That's what I mean by this. If we deploy them, Germany must have access. We must be in control of the process. We cannot continue to follow this old reflex of handing over our security to the USA and saying, that's not our issue. That has to stop. That's what I mean by the need for a change in thinking. And this is also evident in this example of intermediate-range systems. The fact that it was a bilateral agreement with the Americans and not a NATO-wide one, that it wasn't coordinated within the alliance, that there was no parliamentary or political discussion about it, but that it was simply carried out, especially given a very erratic American president, that's not acceptable. We can't keep doing things this way. In this agreement, we also included the possibility of Europeanizing these systems, which is a good thing. It can be done temporarily with American systems, but I must insist that we also have national control over this, and that it's not something that doesn't concern us.
Technical question. Is it possible to bring these American systems completely under German control? Would that mean you wouldn't need any Americans for them at all? Or, if you use American technology, is there always still a certain degree of control by the Americans, or at least a veto over its use? Like a technical veto, along the lines of, "We're not giving you the key." Isn't that always a problem lurking in the background?
Yes, that's true. We see the same thing with nuclear sharing. The nuclear weapons stored in Germany are ultimately under American control. They have to be authorized, and then they are deployed. But this nuclear sharing also takes place within NATO. There is a nuclear planning group, and Germany is also involved in that. So there is a certain form of consultation, but no co-decision. And to be honest, that's no longer acceptable. That's not future-proof anymore, if I may say so. Germany, or Europe, also needs to be held more accountable here. And ultimately, we need a Europeanization of NATO and a stronger European footprint, of course. The tragedy is just that Europeans are still far from being able to achieve something like this at the moment. But at least there are efforts being made. And that's exactly what matters to me for the future. That security policy is made more for Germany's national interests and not for some other countries like Ukraine. I mean, come on, that's just not acceptable.
It simply leads to the situation where self-defense is suddenly perceived as defending others, and people end up going abroad to fight. For example, defending Germany in the Hindu Kush. That basically means sending people abroad to fight there. And you just have to hope that, in retrospect, it doesn't turn out that it wasn't such a great war after all.
No, that was not a great war. Above all, it was a pointless war. The entire Ukraine war was pointless because the political issues were known before the outbreak of war. In fact, Putin launched a corresponding political initiative in December 2021 to ultimately prevent this war. And ultimately, that's what needs to be picked up on. We need to take another close look at what this offer, this demand from the Russians was at the time. And that's where we need to start again, ultimately, to reach an agreement. The Americans will do that with the Russians as well. The Europeans are out of the game. So at this meeting, if it takes place, there won't be any Europeans present. And probably not Zelensky either. So the two of them will discuss the parameters of a possible ceasefire, or alternatively the parameters of a future escalation. We are out of the game, and for me as a German and also as a European, that is unbearable. But ultimately, this is the result of our policies over the past 4 years. This war could have been prevented. Militarily, this war was already decided at a very early stage by the end of 22. And I have said this since then, there is no military solution. That was simply dismissed, ultimately with massive media support, and people believed they could still turn things around. In Germany, the delivery of Leopard tanks was called a game changer. That was crazy and totally idiotic, but everyone believed it. And now hopefully we are slowly realizing that there is no military solution, at least not one in the West's favor, and that we therefore need to get out of this war, which is extremely dangerous for both Europe and Germany.
I absolutely agree with you. But is there any scenario in which Europe would simply refuse and say, no, we're just not participating anymore? So at the national level, no more funds and no more weapons. We stop now, we cut off the oxygen to this war from our side. I think that's very unrealistic. But in your assessment, does this option exist?
Nein, die gibt's nicht. Machtpolitisch ist ganz klar, wer
No, there isn't. In terms of power politics, it's very clear who calls the shots in the West or within NATO. And in the end, the NATO countries have done everything to meet the American demands, including the 2%. In part, it's justified that we need to do more, but not with this hysteria and this excessive armament without a policy of balance with Russia. That wasn't necessary, but it happened anyway. You also have to see that with the 2% defense budgets, a lot of that money flows back to America. That's a big deal for Trump, of course, because we still have to, or want to, buy most of our weapon systems from the US. And the relevant parameters have ultimately been agreed upon with the EU and with the Americans. So in the end, we are what J.D. Vance once said. The European states are nothing more than American client states. You could also call them vassal states. But I think, looking ahead, this is an intolerable situation, and we need to get out of it. We cannot keep playing the role of America's model student. The Germans are particularly at risk in this regard. We need a stronger, more independent position, also on a European level, including economically. This cannot go on, because we can already see where we'll end up if we continue like this.
Last question. Do you think we'll get there? Because part of my analysis, also based on the conversations I have on this channel, is that a large part of the political decisions that have been made are connected to the fact that elite circles in politics were, to a great extent, shaped in these elite schools, the transatlantic elite schools, and that we have people like Mr. Merz, who was previously on the board at BlackRock, and that we have people who have close ties to the US and therefore also have an interest in maintaining this partnership. Do you think, with the people currently available in politics, that we have the possibility in the coming years to change the guidelines here?
Well, Mr. Lotaz, you mentioned the word partnership. We simply have to make sure that we are and remain equal partners of the United States. I have nothing against a close transatlantic alliance, but I do take issue with us having politicians who say exactly what Washington is thinking at the moment, especially in the last legislative period. That was fascinating to me. Whenever then Secretary of State Blinken said something, 6 hours later, our foreign minister would say the same thing. Sometimes I wondered whether we could just do away with our foreign ministry altogether and simply delegate it to the State Department. That's not how it works, and it can't go on like this. We also need to cooperate with the Americans. We depend on them, but we have to make sure that, as Europeans, we are on equal footing and not just playing the role of the pawn, which is currently the case. We need to get out of this mode and become equal partners in the alliance. And if there are threats or blackmail, such as with tariffs or economic measures, then we must respond accordingly by, for example, redirecting, redefining, and conducting our business elsewhere. Germany is an export nation, and that is important. And we have no interest, also for economic reasons, in a division of the world into good democracies and supposedly bad autocracies. But that can't be it. That's too simple. And that also applies to our relationship with Russia. We simply need to get out of that. And that's why I'm actually grateful to the American President Trump for taking the initiative since his presidency to start talking to the Russians again. And he is doing that. It's a shame the Europeans didn't do it. I really called for it for months, and I still don't understand it to this day. That's also a topic in this book here with Klaus von Donani, why we don't want to talk to the Russians. At some point, we'll probably have to do it, but I just don't understand it.
The
good news is that the Russians have always said, when the Europeans have recovered, we'll still be here. So the Russians have always said, we'll talk again when something comes up. Mr. Vad, for the people who would like to buy the book, where should they go? Where can they find it?
Yes, you can already order it on Amazon. Of course, I don't want to advertise, but eventually it will also be available in bookstores, and you can purchase it there as well.
And I believe also directly from West End Verlag, if I remember correctly.
But it's definitely best through the book trade.
I will definitely add links in the description. Mr. Vad, thank you very much for your time today.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Ladas.